You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello, my name is Robin Erickson, and I'm a principal researcher in the Human Capital Center at the Conference Board. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Insights, a podcast series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, my co-author and distinguished principal research fellow, Deb Cohen, is joining me to discuss our recently published report, Different in Degree, Closing the Talent Gap with Alternative Credentials. Hey, Deb, welcome, and thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Robin.
What are credentials, and why is this an important conversation to have?
Well, I think this is an important issue right now, but it's also a timely issue. People are talking a lot about credentials, and when we think of credentials, they're really considered proof of an individual's expertise or their experience. And they're important because they're a signal to employers about what a candidate knows or what they can do. And credentials come in many forms. So officially, the Conference Board defines a credential and alternative credentials as follows. A credential is the qualification or evidence that an individual possesses to be considered for a job. Official credentials take many forms, such as a degree or licenses, and an alternative credential may include certifications, certificates, or successfully performing and demonstrating proof of competence. So now that we have that foundation, Robin, can you tell us what some of the recent Conference Board research has told us about what employers are doing and what the benefits are for using alternative credentials?
Sure. So despite the recent tight labor market, which ended obviously in March, but it was one of the tightest labor markets ever, in fact, here in the U.S. But even with that tight labor market, surprisingly few organizations are accepting alternative credentials. In fact, the Conference Board did the Labor Shortages Solutions Survey of 225 HR executives around the U.S. and found that only 18% of U.S. companies accept alternative credentials, such as a certification, like you just described. But organizations are gingerly taking steps toward other alternative credentials, such as reassessing skills, creating apprenticeships, or lowering experience requirements. In terms of what TCB members are telling us about the benefits of using alternative credentials, they've been found to increase the diversity of applicant pools because they create a more diverse workforce. And diversity has been found to increase innovation and ultimately revenue by 19%. And right now, in this very tight time that we're finding in terms of economics with so many people unemployed with COVID-19, it really would be useful for organizations to be able to increase their revenue because we do believe that diversity does do that. And we have a lot of other articles and podcasts on diversity. So if you're interested in those topics, please take a look for those. But alternative credentials also offer employers access to varied skills and worker credentials. In fact, one HR executive that we interviewed said, it's important to look at the cost of education on the availability of diverse talent pools, because in the 2007-2008 timeframe, degrees were an artificial barrier to screen out candidates because unemployment was so high. And we did this research before COVID-19 happened. And so when the labor market was tight, but we're in the same place as we were then, so the cost of education is going to make a difference in terms when so many of us are looking to our pocketbooks and are being hit hard by the economic implications of COVID. And then another executive that we interviewed commented that no matter how many workers are needed, it's the organization's responsibility to consider all possibilities. And that means to be willing to look beyond traditional credentials. And this executive actually said to us, if you truly want to build a great company, team, culture, or organization, whether it be your team of 5 or 5,000, you have to do the hard work evaluating people on their ability to perform the job, not their ability to get degrees or certifications in X, Y, or Z. So, Deb, let me ask you a few questions. What does the external research tell us about the benefits and value of alternative credentials?
Well, Robin, there's actually been a lot of interest and research on this topic right now. in fact, we know that alternative credentials, as you mentioned before, you were talking a little bit about diversity. Well, alternative credentials widen the pool of qualified candidates by using indicators other than degrees as a proxy for skills and qualifications that workers need to possess. And so embracing alternative credentials, they send a message to students and incumbent workers, I should say, that there are really additional pathways to success. Increasing the diversity of applicant pools creates obviously a more diverse workforce. And that's the result that we clearly want. And as you might recall, many of the talent executives talked about the critical need for reskilling workers, which we'll talk a little bit about later as well, to ensure that retention and continued fit between workers and jobs. So reskilling and a focus beyond a single credential, such as a degree, is another benefit that we can also look for in terms of alternative credentials.
So, Deb, thank you. I know that there are thousands of alternative credentials. Why don't you tell our listeners about the array of credentials that are available to both workers and organizations?
Okay, how much time do you have, Robin? Because this is a this is a complex question, since there's this extensive array of credentials that are available. So let me start and sort of give you the categories. To start with, there's higher education, which includes a range of, as we've talked about, degrees, whether it's a BA, an MBA, a PhD, a MS, BS, what have you. But another well-known set of credentials also includes things like licenses, such as being a CPA or having your JD or an MD. Some professions require licenses in order to practice. But then there's a whole slew of things called certificates and certifications that are very widely available. Certificates are offered oftentimes by training and educational providers, and certification is typically awarded by an industry body or some other agency. And there's pretty wide variation in both certificates and certifications. And one of the challenges is that people oftentimes use these two words interchangeably, and they call certificates certification and certification certificates. But there's really a big difference in that a certification is something that typically requires that a test or some assessment demonstrate that a body of knowledge has been obtained, whereas a certificate demonstrates that time was invested in obtaining that certificate. There's no real test to that. A few other categories for credentials include things like apprenticeships and internships. There's also a whole new range of supplemental credentials that are available today that include things like badges, boot camps, micro credentials. These are sometimes offered by educational institutes, or by independent training businesses. And then the final type is, of course, one of the best known credentials, which is previous experience that can be documented and show what a person has accomplished or what they're capable of doing. Our report goes into much, much more detail on all of these different things. But it's important to keep in mind, I think, that not all credentials are going to be equally useful to employers. Credentials, including degree programs, exist on a scale ranging from what I would call highly rigorous and meaningful to really highly suspect. The difficult part is that it's not always easy to determine if the program that offers the certificate, certification, or degree has provided the knowledge, the skills, or abilities that it purports to provide. Again, more in the report. So, Robin, now that we've got this sort of foundation of the kinds of alternative credentials, and given the fact that there's this wide range, how are credentials and alternative credentials actually being used by employers today?
So, as I'm sure most of you know, degrees are the credentials that are most used as a proxy for qualification. And in fact, we often find that when there's high unemployment, many organizations, tune their applicant tracking system to only accept candidates with degrees. But some of the talent executives that we interviewed told us that the 4-year degree is less important or valuable than it once was. And while this may be true, the more specific concern that was expressed by those we interviewed was the failure of 4-year degrees to create sufficient pathways to success for both employers and workers. So in a few cases, we found out in our survey and in our interviews, employers have been very intentional in dropping degree requirements or in allowing alternatives to be used instead of degrees. In other cases, organizations allow for alternatives, but require the open requisitions to be pulled, modified, and then reposted when they weren't finding the candidates that they needed, which adds more time to the talent acquisition process. So we have some suggestions for how to fix that coming up. But at this point in our program, we're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to discuss the alternative credentials and how they can be used within organizations.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello again. I'm Robin Erickson with the Conference Board. Welcome to the second half of our podcast, and thanks for joining my co-author, Deb Cohen, and me as we discuss how important alternative credentials are to organizations. We looked at 3 areas where organizations have begun to consider alternative credentials. Those are workforce planning, training and reskilling, and the recruitment process. So I'll start off with how credentials are important from a workforce planning perspective. Workforce planning focuses on ensuring that an organization has the right talent at the right time to execute on organizational goals and objectives. Recent skill shortages, especially in terms of finding critical technical and specific roles, and the recent cost-cutting measures that employers have been forced to take, especially since COVID-19, are forcing organizations to engage in better planning and more robust strategies and tactics to attract, develop, and retain workers. In addition, the increased remote work has put workforce planning in a whole new light because we don't know how long knowledge workers are going to be forced to work from home. So many of the executives we interviewed stated that they are looking for the widest access to talent, but they still need mechanisms to narrow the pool to qualified workers with the right skills for the right jobs. More importantly, though, several executives mentioned the need to create pathways for new and incumbent workers to couple what they're good with along with what they want to do. And I think that's really important because, we can all do many things, but what do we really want to do? So as part of a workforce planning strategy, we think that organizations should develop action plans that include understanding alternative credentials and then build mechanisms to help workers obtain them, and then train your hiring managers and your recruiters to look for them. So, Deb, I know that you spent many years as a business school professor and obviously have deep knowledge when it comes to learning and development. In what ways are credentials important to training and reskilling?
Well, thanks, Robin, and thank you for those great insights on workforce planning. Very important as a backdrop here. So we've known for a very long while that training and reskilling is very important. It was an important topic of conversation, leading up to the current pandemic, and it still is an important topic of conversation because of the importance of reskilling people just to be able to do their jobs today. So a consistent theme from the executives that we interviewed was that they really needed to hire for skills, but not only skills, to also focus on retraining and reskilling workers. In fact, one pointed out that if you could hire folks that had the basic skills, you could then put your training dollars into reskilling. And it's interesting because research has shown that over 40% of each employee's skills will no longer be relevant in 4 years. And this analysis did not factor in sort of the seismic economic impact that we've seen from COVID-19 right now. that is really still playing out. So from an L&D perspective, a learning and development perspective, an alternative credential, frankly, is typically cheaper than a 4-year degree or a master's degree, and really could provide the basis for upskilling and reskilling. And this is for both incumbents and for applicants. So it's an important thing for us to consider. A second point on training and skills and evaluating skills is the whole concept of using predictive analytics. And we've heard a lot about using predictive analytics in talent management. And there's 2 points I want to make here. First, we recommend that organizations use analytics to track the effectiveness of employees who have obtained alternative credentials or are receiving training. And, we talk about predictive analytics a lot in talent, but here's an example where an organization can take a look at all of the employees who either come in with an alternative credential or who they support to get one, and evaluate whether or not those individuals are able to perform at the level that the organization, finds acceptable. And this form of tracking can help organizations estimate the performance of these employees and whether or not they've been able to move into roles where new skills are needed. And then the second point, I think, is that investing in training and upskilling of recruiters and hiring managers themselves to better understand alternative credentials may also support this talent acquisition process overall as well. So, Robin, you've done a lot of research in this area of talent management and specifically talent acquisition. What do you think are some of the implications for the recruitment process regarding alternative credentials?
Sure. Thank you, Deb. And thanks for explaining about the importance of training and reskilling. In terms of talent acquisition, though, employers typically encounter alternative credentials when they are hiring and promoting. I mean, that just makes sense, right? That's when organizations are looking to see if individuals have the credentials that they need. But once organizations better understand the competencies that various credentials represent, they need to ensure that their recruitment processes are aligned, specifically in terms of hiring for job descriptions and credential assessments. And so our suggestion is that in terms of job descriptions, all roles in an organization should be described in a job profile that includes the requirements needed for successful execution. The recruiters and hiring managers should be able then to align the skills for each role with any applicable alternative credentials, in addition to required and preferred experience. Many organizations use experience, which is also an alternative credential. That might be new to some of you to think about experience that way. But they use experience as a substitute for degree in their job descriptions, especially for promotion. So some people would say, in lieu of a 4-year college degree, we would want you to have 4 years of experience. So it's something like that. But 2 of the different organizations that we interviewed actually told us similar stories regarding a project management role that had required a degree in the past, but had been recently modified to accept years of relevant experience in lieu of a degree. They had people who had been doing the job, but didn't have the title because they didn't have that degree. But so that was really sort of fun to hear from 2 different organizations. So the next thing we want to talk about is around credential assessments. And, as Deb mentioned, there are thousands of certifications. And then there are many, many different types of certifications. So, Deb, one of the biggest issues for companies is how do workers in organizations evaluate credentials, and what are the questions they should be asking?
Thanks, Robin. And again, a great question here, because there are so many credentials that are available that both the employers and workers really need to assess what they're getting when either the organization hires someone or when somebody decides to obtain an alternative credential. You really need to sort of take a look under the hood, essentially. And, organizations really have to develop this assessment process to figure out what the rigor and validity is of those credentials. Oftentimes if you see that somebody has a degree from XYZ university, you're familiar with the university, you're familiar with the degree. There's not a whole lot of analysis that needs to go in if you are aware of that. But alternative credentials, really because they offer so much promise to both employers and workers, the challenge here is that there are almost no standards for what they should include, how they're developed, and how they should be evaluated. Let me repeat that. There are almost no standards on what should be included, how they're developed. And that's a little bit difficult because that means that anybody can do anything and stick a label on it and call it a certificate or credential of some sort. And in fact, according to one source that we looked at, there are more than 730,000 confirmed credentials in the US alone. So imagine how difficult it is to bring transparency and understanding, let alone quality control, to this landscape. It's a very dense landscape, if you will. But we do suggest 3 different lines of questions that employers and recruiters can use to evaluate the credential when they see it coming up in applications. And I think also that workers can use this to help them evaluate whether or not they should invest in something. So the first line of questioning is about the credential program itself. And these are just a few of the questions. Is the credential accredited by a third party? What's their reputation? How many people hold this credential? A second line of questions could be quality assurance. Is there an advisory board or subject matter experts guiding the curriculum? And how often is the curriculum updated? Are there published learning objectives? We know that technology and many things move fast today, which means if a curriculum was developed one year and hasn't been evaluated or updated within a year or 2 years, then it's entirely possible that the material is dated. So you need to have that quality assurance. And then the third line of questioning is around sort of student/worker focused, meaning, is the credential affordable? And is the composition of those completing the credential diverse? So if there's a high price tag to something, it may well be that not everybody can afford to take that credential. And if that's the case, then the credential isn't going to offer diverse candidates. So how do students demonstrate their learning and their skills when they're done with this credential? An employer needs to know that, and somebody who's obtaining that needs to know, how will I be able to demonstrate what I have learned and what I can do as a result of this credential? So those are 3 lines of questioning that we recommend.
So, Deb, then what are the things that employers, workers, and educators need to know in the future?
Great question, Robin. Thank you. Employers, first of all, need to know that not only is it okay to use alternative credentials, but it's really essential to do so if you want to maintain the skills that you need in the workforce today, even with a labor market that perhaps is not as tight because of COVID-19 and what we're going through right now. Many folks still maintain that there will continue to be a skills shortage. Second, workers need to know that obtaining credentials are really a good thing. But I also submit that, like employers, workers really have to do their due diligence and vet the programs they invest in for themselves. And the final area that I think we need to talk about is educators. We haven't really talked much about educators, but they're really an important part of this discussion as well. Educators need to know that partnering with employers is really necessary on a programmatic level, not just in terms of relationship building. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple minutes. So, Robin, what are some of the actionable insights for organizations on the use of alternative credentials?
Thanks, Deb. So the first insight for what's ahead is that in order to find qualified candidates in the current and future labor market, employers need to take the time to understand the array of alternative credentials that are available, as you went through. They need to learn how to evaluate the quality, the relevance, and the predictive capability of different alternative credentials. And it's imperative for employers to know and appreciate the differences that different credentials offer. A certificate that offers a certain number of classroom or online hours may be very different from a certification that uses a validated assessment to determine whether the student has attained the requisite capability and knowledge. So not all credentials are created equal, with literally hundreds of thousands. I think you said 730,000.
I did.
Different credentials available. It's not prudent to assume that all credentials represent the same rigor and offer the same value.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. And a second insight, we mentioned this a minute ago, that to hire and retain workers, organizations should invest in reskilling and upskilling. But more than that, they really need to expand their benefit policies to include earning-specific alternative credentials, including perhaps partial or total reimbursement, or rewards for achievement. Most employers are not investing enough in training programs to reskill workers. There's lots of research out there to tell us that, and to train for anticipated skill gaps. So obtaining alternative credentials like certifications is typically cheaper than a 4-year college degree, but it could provide the basis for upskilling and reskilling. And with the explosion of student debt that we've seen, it really benefits workers to spend less money preparing for a specific role. And it behooves the organization to reimburse part or all of a degree tuition, but most don't have policies for alternative credentials. So we recommend that in addition to having policies for degrees, they also have policies for obtaining alternative credentials so that they support workers in doing so.
Completely agree. And the next insight is around talent acquisition. And as I had mentioned, employers need to invest the time to reassess the job descriptions and train their hiring managers and talent acquisition staff to recognize an expanded view of alternative credentials, especially for those roles that they have hard times filling in their organizations. So, as I mentioned early on, organizations have been slow to make changes to their talent acquisition process to account for the range of alternative credentials. But given the complexity and confusion around them, it's important that organizations use competency-based language in their job descriptions that communicate the behaviors and capabilities that are required for hiring and promotion. Once you do that, it's much easier for organizations to better understand the competencies that various credentials represent, and then make sure that their recruitment processes are aligned and that staff are trained to recognize the value of these alternative credentials. And then predictive analytics can be used over time to evaluate the success of using those alternative credentials.
Absolutely. Very much an important investment. A fourth insight is to prepare for the ever-evolving roles needed in the future. Organizations need to hire for potential as well as for specific skills. Skill demands will continue to evolve, and although there may be an abundance of workers at the moment, there may well be a continued skill shortage. So focusing on long-term needs creates what we would call a build versus a buy talent strategy that will serve organizations well. When organizations hire for potential, they're hiring for values and for motivation and capability to learn new skills. And leading organizations are really beginning to shift their recruitment strategies. In the past, college degrees have been used as a filter, as we've mentioned, for hiring. But alternative credentials now allow organizations to broaden their talent pools with workers from many educational backgrounds and offer additional opportunities going forward. And before we close out here, I'd like to add one final insight before you add your final thoughts here, Robin. To avoid skill shortages for specific roles and to anticipate the skills needed in the future, employers really should partner with educators to ensure that curriculum options reflect what is needed in the workforce. All too often there's a disconnect between what educators teach and require of students and what employers actually need the workers of tomorrow to know and to be able to do. So, for example, employers can proactively work with universities from whom they often recruit to provide insight into their skills and knowledge to ensure that the faculty and the study programs provide the required knowledge and skills that they're offering. I talked not too long ago with an engineering professor at a large state university, and as he put it, the wheels of change move very slowly in academia, and changing curricula is often difficult and slow. But this is exactly what needs to change in order to ensure that a partnership is created. Robin, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you so much, Deb. And it is true that the wheels of change move very slowly, but I do think that we will be looking at all of this in light of COVID, much more so. And just so our audience knows, we actually wrote this report during one of the tightest labor markets in the history, which ended obviously at some point in February. But we decided this report was still really relevant because even though organizations will probably have more candidates for all their open roles, they also will have they need to have more diversity. And that's been made very clear to us in recent weeks. And so we decided that, it's really important for organizations to be thinking about how they're using alternative credentials, and that by using them, they can add more diversity to their workforces. So in closing, this is Robin Erickson at the Conference Board. I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast with my colleague, Deb Cohen. The executive summary for this report is available to the public on the Human Capital Center page at the Conference Board's main website, www.conference-board.org. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And if you'd like to find out more, please visit our website at tcb.org/podcasts or webcasts for more interactive programs. You can also find our podcasts on other platforms like iTunes or Spotify. Thanks again, and goodbye.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.